Hello and welcome to Late Night Elections. Today we're going to be looking at a very important upcoming Senate race in the 2020 election, and that is the Iowa Senate race between Republican incumbent Joni Ernst and Democratic challenger Theresa Greenfield. Pretty much every indication shows that this is going to be an extremely close race with either candidate having a good shot at winning. So in this video, I really just want to go over each of the candidates, their background, their strengths, their weaknesses, look at some of the existing polling data, and look into what Greenfield and Ernst's path to victory is and how they might get this seat. This is going to be a very important seat in this election as the Democrats attempt to gain control of the Senate and the Republicans try to maintain the control they already have. So this is going to be one of those toss-up states that could go either way. And if the Democrats do want to pick up the Senate, this is going to be a really nice seat to have. Not necessarily a must-have, but it certainly makes things a lot easier. And from the Republican standpoint, if they lose this seat, then things are not looking very good for maintaining control of the Senate. So looking deeper into each of the two major candidates, first up is Joni Ernst, who, as I said, is the Republican candidate, and she is the incumbent. She was first elected back in 2014, so this is her first re-election cycle that she's running on, which is really important because it's a very different dynamic when you're running for re-election versus running for being elected into that public office for the first time, since now she has a record that people can look to and say, I like this or I don't like this, these votes that she cast and these things that she did. She didn't have that as much back in 2014. She had some experience in lower level like state politics, but now she has that federal political experience that people can look to and that her record can be scrutinized. She's also the first female combat veteran to serve in the U.S. Senate, which is both kind of a fun fact and it's a good talking point for electability on the campaign trail. Also, going back to her 2014, she's still pretty well known for a campaign ad that her campaign ran where she vowed to make them squeal. And that's kind of, if you think of like the drain the swamp type of talking point, it's sort of like that, just more of like an Iowa farmer twist on it with pigs. And today she's mostly in line with President Trump, so a lot of the same policy priorities. She always reiterates that she's very much in support of him. And so as we go into this election, how the presidential race is going between Joe Biden and Donald Trump is probably going to have a pretty good effect on the outcome of this race as well, since she is very tied to him. Now, on the other side of things, we have Democratic challenger Theresa Greenfield, and she is a former real estate executive and actually has no previous experience being elected to public office in politics. So a little bit of a unorthodox background, not too unusual because there are a lot of people that don't come from political or military backgrounds of anything of that nature, but she doesn't have that political experience. So as I was talking about with Joni Ernst, she doesn't have that record that you can scrutinize. She can list her important issues and list what policies she might enact, but she doesn't have a record that can be scrutinized, which is actually very helpful for her going into this campaign because she can use Ernst's record against her, but she doesn't really have that record of her own that can be attacked. She's also pretty much a fairly standard Democrat. You know, she's not like too far left. She's not too moderate. She's about what you would expect from kind of almost like a generic Democrat. So there's not really anything too uncontroversial there. There's not really that much that stands out. She's a Democrat. What you see is what you get. And she also won her primary fairly easily. So it's not like there's a ton of conflict within the Democratic Party. If we go on over to looking at what the primary results actually were, we can see that she won with almost 48% of the vote. She had around twice as many votes as the second place person in that race, who was Michael Franken. He was a former admiral and actually got the endorsement of the Des Moines Register, which is a pretty prominent endorsement within Iowa. But Theresa Greenfield had the backing and funding of the Democratic Party, so she was able to use that to cruise to a pretty easy victory over Michael Franken, over Kimberly Graham, who was more of the progressive challenger, and over Eddie Mauro, who was more of the moderate alternative. When it comes to polling, there really actually isn't that much polling out there, and the polling that is out there is sort of outdated at this point, which is surprising given that this is such an important race. It isn't necessarily viewed as important or as close as maybe some of the other races, but you'd expect there to be some more polling coming out of this race, and I do expect there to be probably a handful more polls come out before the actual election night on November 3rd. But we can look at what we do have, and we definitely see that this is a very close race, even though these polls are outdated and stuff could have changed by then. But if we look at, especially here on the RCP average, we have the Monmouth poll and the Des Moines Register poll. Now, these are very good polls on 538. These are both A+ rated polls. You can see with the Monmouth one, Ernst was up 1 point, 48 to 47. Now, that did have a pretty low sample size of just 401 likely voters. And so because of that, it's going to have a 4.9 margin of error, which is pretty high. So really, that Ernst +1, it might be Ernst +4. It could be Greenfield +3. There's a lot of margin for error there, but it does show a pretty close, pretty even race. We go back, this is back in June, so this is a few months outdated at this point, but Des Moines Register poll, very good poll. Greenfield up 46 to 43, up 3 points. Then the only other poll is actually back from late April, early May, and that is actually a Democrat-sponsored poll. But despite that, it's still a decent poll. It's not as good as Monmouth, not as good as Des Moines Register, but it's still a B-rated poll on 538, and that also showed Ernst +1. So the overall spread here, Greenfield just plus 0.3, and so that's nothing. It's basically dead even according to this, and it really could go either way based on the polling. But again, this isn't super recent, and this is kind of outdated at this point. So hopefully we get some new polling soon showing the state of the race right now. So since this is such a close race, both candidates have very viable paths to victory. So in this part of the video, I just want to go over what Greenfield's path to victory is, what Ernst's path to victory is, and the different factors that might influence the race in their favor. So when it comes to Theresa Greenfield, she has a big advantage because this is a presidential election year. And in presidential election years, Democrats tend to do better. They tend to have higher turnout. And so Joe Biden's performance, we'll see how that race goes. But if he has a strong performance, which the polling seems to indicate, Theresa Greenfield might get kind of a trickle-down boost from that. And because of that higher turnout in the presidential election year, she has a good chance of victory. Also, Iowa is one of the hardest hit states right now from COVID-19. It has the worst infection rate in the country at the time of this video being published. And Kim Reynolds, who is the Republican governor of Iowa, has the lowest coronavirus approval rating in terms of her response to the pandemic. So even though Joni Ernst is a federal U.S. senator and she doesn't have any direct control over the Iowa state policy to that, Joni Ernst and Kim Reynolds kind of get grouped together because they are both Iowa Republicans, and they're both they have a fairly good relationship with one another. So sort of that backlash from that and that low approval rating from Iowa voters, that could help Greenfield as well. People are looking for a change. She's also a pretty uncontroversial, safe pick. As I was mentioning earlier when I was going over Theresa Greenfield's background, she doesn't have that public office political experience, so she doesn't have a record that can be scrutinized. She was a former real estate executive. She doesn't really have anything super controversial in her past, and she's not too moderate but not too left-wing, so she kind of hits that sweet spot in terms of her ideology and her policy proposals. So as a fairly standard Democrat, there's really nothing too crazy that the Democratic Party has to worry about with her. And then the final thing that's really going to help her if she wants to win is that right now, Joni Ernst does not have a very good approval rating. She has one of the lowest approval ratings of any sitting Republican senator in the country. And so it looks like a lot of Iowa voters just don't really want Joni Ernst. And so they might be compelled to vote for Theresa Greenfield just as a change and an alternative to her. But it's very possible that Joni Ernst could hang on to her seat and win re-election in her second term as a senator. And so she has a few things going for her as well. First of all is the incumbent advantage. A lot of times the current incumbent sort of has a built-in advantage just because they're what voters are familiar with. And unless they've done something super controversial or just were a really awful senator, that kind of gives them a little boost. There's been a little bit of controversy recently with Joni Ernst about kind of a conspiracy over COVID-19 data. But other than that, there hasn't been anything like too crazy about her. So she might be able to still get that incumbent advantage. Also, Iowa is a state that's been trending Republican, trending red in general. So as kind of a lean red state, you would expect Joni Ernst, who is the Republican, to have a little bit of a built-in advantage there. There's also the possibility, since this is still about 2 months out from election night, that the COVID-19 situation improves. If we have a vaccine candidate that gets approved, if the infection rate goes way down, if the economy keeps improving, if everything's kind of getting better from that, the backlash over that might not affect Joni Ernst nearly as much. And so that's kind of just going to be a little bit of a watch and see what happens situation as that keeps developing. Because right now it definitely appears that coronavirus is something hurting Joni Ernst, hurting Republicans in general in a lot of places, but that could easily change as time goes on. Finally, she has kind of an opportunity in that Theresa Greenfield, while she is kind of, the uncontroversial, the safe pick, she's also pretty uninspiring as a candidate. You look at other states like Arizona with the Democratic challenger Mark Kelly. He's a very inspiring candidate and people love him. People don't really care about Theresa Greenfield that much. There's nothing wrong with her, but there's really not a ton going for her either. She's just a generic, standard, safe pick. And so a lot of the people that are going to be voting for her might not necessarily be voting for her as so much as against Joni Ernst. And a lot of times when you don't have the super inspiring candidate, that doesn't always end up well. And so that's a potential pickup for Ernst as well. So with that all being said, what is my final thought on the Iowa Senate race? Well, like I said, pretty much every indicator is that this is going to be an extremely close race. There's still a couple months until election night, so a lot can happen. A lot of it might hinge on coronavirus and how that situation develops with the economy and testing and case numbers and all that. So we'll just kind of have to wait and see at this point. But you can really make a case for either one of these candidates being the winner. And so my final election rating for this is going to be a toss-up, which is pretty much what all the major analysts are saying. It's pretty hard to give a serious advantage to either one of these candidates. If I had to pick right now, I might give Theresa Greenfield just a very slight edge, but we're talking, less than 1% final results kind of edge. So there's still a lot that can change by this point, and I could easily see this race going either way. So thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this Iowa Senate race breakdown. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a like below and subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be talking about some other Senate races in the near future, some House races, the presidential election, of course. And so be sure to stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching.